All right. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday, week 11. How are you doing?
Yeah, next week is like the last week, right?
Second last.
Oh, so there's 13.
Yep, there's 13. So the last week is the week of the 20th, the 30th, maybe? November 30th to December 4th or something like that. So we're getting there. We're getting close. Right. Let's say hi to some people first. So Mike is here. Good morning, Mike. And Miles is here. Hello, Miles. Good morning. Chan's here. Good morning, Chan. Clara's here. Hello, Clara. Sala's here. Good morning. And Vicky is here. Hello, Vicky. And Daniel's here. Hey, Daniel. And Shimimu's here. Hello to you. Okay. Let's pick up where we were yesterday. So yesterday, we finished talking about Indigenous people in Canada. We watched that part of that documentary called Eighth Fire, and I think we kind of saw, or I hope we saw, some of the struggles that Indigenous people face across Canada. There are different kinds of struggles depending on people's backgrounds and kind of who they are. But I think we also saw some ways in which they are in the process of kind of rediscovering and reinventing their identities and their culture and their place in Canada, right? And so that's very much an ongoing conversation and an ongoing process. That relationship is frayed and damaged between Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians. A year or so ago, I would have told you that I think we're on the path to, moving along and getting to a better place. At the moment, I would say yes, I think we are on that path, but we're not moving as fast as maybe I thought we were a year or so ago. And so it's slow progress, right? There are a lot of issues that need to get dealt with in a country the size of Canada. This is one that very clearly and urgently needs to be dealt with, but unfortunately people's attention is often distracted by other things, right? And when you have a pandemic and Donald Trump, I mean that eats up a lot of news time, right? And so things like this, even though they desperately need to be rectified and paid attention to, often they don't get paid attention to. And so again, the reconciliation, the healing of this relationship, I think is happening. I think maybe a year or two ago, I felt like we were moving forward faster. Right now, I don't feel like we are moving anywhere at all. I think we will get there eventually, but it's a long process. It's going to take a long time. But I think it was exciting to see in that documentary some ways in which Indigenous people were kind of rebuilding their culture and revitalizing their culture and kind of rebuilding their identity as Indigenous people in Canada, right? Because again, at one time in the past, they were a certain group of people, right? They were living on the land and they were attached to it and integrated with it and living their own kind of existence. Then Western European people came and tried to sweep them off to the side and marginalize them. And now, again, they're trying to find their place in a country that's been created by foreigners, effectively, right? People like me. And so, but again, I think it's encouraging. I think that things are happening, and what are some of the things that we saw in the video that were kind of encouraging in terms of Indigenous people kind of reclaiming their heritage and identity?
They expose their culture to other people.
Right, so we see Indigenous culture being expressed and shared with others, right? In what way did we see those things, that culture being shared?
There's like a guy who teaches the student about Indigenous people.
Right, so we see direct education happening in community colleges and things like that. What else do we see? Right, we see mixed daycare where Indigenous and non-Indigenous kids are kind of being taken care of but are learning indigenous sort of values and worldviews. Yeah, that's happening. What else is happening?
The girl teaching women to stand up, I think, and naming her children after native names.
Right. So yeah, Nakuset was she was running a women's shelter, right? And so yeah, so she was helping probably indigenous and non-indigenous women, but probably lots of indigenous women who are in difficult situations, who may need protection and a place to stay. But she's also she's helping them, but she's also helping by sort of teaching, engaging with her traditional culture, and sort of teaching her kids that way as well, and even naming them, right? And so naming them creates space for indigenous culture to be spread, right? Because it identifies them as who they are, right? What else?
The ceremonies held in some parts of Canada too.
Right. So there's indigenous kind of rituals and gatherings being held. Yep, that's definitely happening. Here in British Columbia, the indigenous people have their larger kind of gatherings are called potlatches. Have you ever heard of a potlatch? No? Yeah? What's a potlatch?
I don't know what this was.
But you've heard about it? Yeah, so a potlatch is something that indigenous people in this part of the world often do. And at the potlatch, everybody comes together, and what it is it's a gathering. Lots of, kind of traditional ritual dances get done. People talk, people, have fun, people eat, but they also exchange things. They also exchange goods. And so in hundreds of years ago, before there was Western people here, this is one of the ways in which people got the things that they needed. So they didn't buy them, they gave them away. And so, and if you were someone who was kind of a more powerful or a more prestigious person in the community, you would often get lots of things. You would get lots of gifts. And so what higher status people in the community would do is they would try to get as much as they could, and then they would hold a potlatch and they would give it all away. And that was one of the ways in which you kind of gained respect and prestige in a culture like this, is by giving. And the more you give, the more respect and status that you gained. And so these guys would, mostly guys, these kind of chiefs and people like that would put together huge amounts of goods, and there'd be food and blankets and canoes and masks and all kinds of different things. And they would have a party for everybody, and they would just give it all away. And again, the prestige and status went to the chief or the guy who could give away more, right? And it's almost like, look how much I can give away. It's not even a thing for me, right? It's like I can just give all this away and it's no big deal. And so and these chiefs would actually compete with each other to try to give away more, right? So I'd give away all this stuff, and then everybody would say, "Oh, Mike's he's the best," right? And so the other chiefs would have to go and try to give away even more at their potlatch to try to challenge me. And so again, you had this kind of massive giving, and everyone was trying to give away as much as they could, to the point where sometimes they would just burn things just to show how much they could give. They're like, "Look, I'll give all of you this stuff, and I'll just burn this stuff because I don't even need it. I'm just going to burn it." So it was kind of strange, but these guys would constantly try to outdo each other and give away more and more. And of course, that was good for the community because the community got all kinds of goods and things, right? So here kind of in the West, we kind of hoard our wealth, right? We give a little bit to charity, if we're nice, but mostly people hold on to their money, or they spend it in a way that shows off how rich they are, right? They drive fancy cars, or they wear fancy clothes, or they have a big fancy mansion or a house somewhere. So here in the West, we often gather lots of resources and then we use them for ourselves, right? We pass them on to our kids, or we, buy fancy things. But in indigenous cultures that kind of traditionally lived in this area, you would get a bunch of stuff and then you would give it all away. And the people who were respected the most were the ones who could give the most. So you could see, of course, when Europeans came here, how difficult it would be to get indigenous people to participate in the economy and get a job and get money when they were all just sharing all their stuff anyway, right? And so in part, that's why they were banning rituals like potlatches, because not only was it a way of transmitting indigenous culture and religion and language, but it also bonded the community together, and it kept them from having to really participate in the European economy, because they got everything they needed by sharing it amongst themselves, not by buying it in the market. And so, again, you see a very different way of seeing the world, but also a totally different economic system, right, that they had. So yeah, those things are happening again. Potlatches are being held. If you're lucky enough to be invited to one, go. It'll be really fun, or interesting at the very least. So I think that video is encouraging, and I think it's nice to, not nice, but I think it's essential to not only learn a little bit about the history of Canada and First Nations people's place in it, but also to see them as living, breathing cultures, right? People who are still around, who are living in our cities and towns and country, and even though they do live right beside us, they often have a different experience of what this country is about, right? And so we should understand that, right? Any last things that we should say about Indigenous people in Canada for now? Or questions or statements, comments? Okay. Next. The next portion of this is, or the next thing I want to talk about is going to sort of dial us back a little bit to when we talked about oppression and power, right? And so we said, of course, that oppression is a set of policies or practices or traditions or norms or explanations or definitions or any of these things that serve to exploit one group at the expense or benefit one group at the expense of another one, right? And so these things are often, oppression doesn't usually happen on a one-to-one, a person-to-person basis. It's usually thought of in terms of how society as a whole operates, right? And so Indigenous people in Canada have been subjected to oppression for hundreds of years, right? Because there have been rules that Indigenous people have had to play by, which the rest of us haven't, right? They've had experiences that systematically damage their culture and their people, right? And so that wasn't the result of any one person doing anything. It was the sort of operation of Canada as a whole, right? So Indigenous people have been and still are systematically oppressed in Canada, right? Yeah, so again, oppression occurs when one group's prejudice is backed by legal authority and historical, social, and institutional power. And I think if you think about Indigenous people in Canada, we can clearly see that, right? That the dominant group, white people or white Europeans in Canada, have had all of those things, right? They had legal authority, they have historical power, they have social power, and they have institutional power, right? White Europeans in Canada hold all of those institutions, right? And so they are able to make society work for them in a way that Indigenous people can't, right? Or struggle to. So what I wanted to do is look at how this oppression kind of plays out amongst individual people, because of course oppression is kind of a society-wide thing, but of course it has effects on individuals and how they interrelate with each other, right? And we talked about that when we talked about internalized dominance and internalized oppression, right? So the easiest way to sort of remember this is the Jane Elliott blue-eyed, brown-eyed kids example, right? Where there were these prejudicial messages spread in the classroom, and the blue-eyed or the brown-eyed kids thought they were smarter and better, and so they kind of internalized that dominance, and then they started to act as if they actually were smarter or better. And the blue-eyed kids, they absorbed those messages and started to act out their internalized oppression, right? They actually felt like they were not as smart and not as good, and they actually started to act that way, right? Even though, of course, there was no difference really between these kids. Intelligence is not connected to eye color at all, but the social messaging helped to make it so, right? So that sort of societal-wide oppression and those kind of social messages and prejudices that circulate in society, those influence people's feelings and behavior and experience, right? So for humans, something that's socially constructed can very easily become real, even though it's not, right? And again, racism is a very clear example of that. There is no meaningful difference between any of the races that have been identified, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't make a difference in society, because it does, right? So I'm just going to jump through these. I think we remember what these things are. I wanted to read an article, okay? And the article is called Race and Gender Oppression in the Classroom, the Experiences of Women Faculty of Color with White Male Students. And so there's a couple of reasons why I would like to read this, and I'll just explain those to you right now. I'm just gonna pull up the article itself. There it is. So a few reasons why I want to read this. Number one, this article is a real, honest-to-goodness academic article, right? And so if and when you go on to university, you're going to have to read academic articles, right? I've sort of, when you're doing research for your papers, I've sort of steered you away from them because most of them are too long. In many cases, they're going to be a little kind of over our head or too complex to deal with. And so I've kind of tried to steer you to newspaper articles and things like that, just so we can get some practice dealing with them. But this is actually a real academic article. And so again, in university, you'll probably have to read these, and it helps to have a little bit of practice reading one and actually kind of knowing how to read one, okay? The second reason that I want to read it, of course, is because it's very on topic for us, and it has some clear examples of how oppression can actually play out amongst people and in an environment that we're all familiar with, right? We're all very familiar with being in a classroom after being in one for 12 years or whatever it's been, right? So we're all very familiar with this environment, and so this article will talk about how that oppression kind of plays out in the classroom as people interact with each other. And again, it's an academic article. We can read it, we can try to understand it, and we can get some tips, okay? Now, I used to have a slide on this, but I see when I look at my slides that I don't. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll have you open up that article, and you can just look at it while I talk about it, okay? Now, you'll see that all articles are basically structured in a very similar way, okay? Huh? That's okay, don't panic. I'm gonna help you with this. Don't panic. I know it's long. Most academic articles are long. That's another reason why I steer you away from them, because they're too much. If I ask you to look at 3 sources and each one is 20 pages, that's too much, right? So most academic articles are long, and the shortest one you'll find is maybe like 8 or 10 pages. The longest ones go like 30 or 40 pages long. So you are going to have to kind of deal with these if and when you head on to university. And so sometimes it's helpful to at least know how these articles work, because for the most part, almost all of them are structured the same way, okay? Okay, so here we've got a title, we've got the author here, Shavella Pittman. I'm not sure, but Shavella Pittman, I feel like this feels like a master's project to me. And so this is like her master's thesis that she turned into an article. That's kind of what it feels like to me. I could be wrong. I don't know anything about Shavella Pittman here, but that's kind of how it reads to me. The first thing that you'll often find is an abstract. Do you know what an abstract is?
Is it like to explain it?
Yeah.
Introduction?
Yeah. Quick brief summary of what the article is actually about, right? So this is going to be super helpful, especially, if you're doing research in university, you might be looking for papers on a certain topic. And yeah, the first thing you want to do is read the abstract to see, do I care about this paper, right? Is this paper useful to me? Is it talking about the thing that I want to talk about? And if it's not, then you can move on, right, and look for another one. So always read the abstract. It's a very quick summary of what the entire article is about. And again, if you're, obviously, if your prof is making you read it, then, at least it gives you an idea of what the article is going to talk about. If you're looking for your own article, like for a research paper, you can get a quick idea of whether it's going to work for you or not, or whether it talks about the thing you want to talk about, okay? Always read the abstract. The first part here you can see is just kind of a bit of an introduction. So when you guys write papers for me, you write a little introduction that sort of generally introduces the topic. And it's the same thing in this article here. Shavella Pittman is going to give us a bit of an introduction to what she's talking about. Sometimes it's worth reading that. The next thing you'll see here is a theoretical framework. And so often you have to talk about this in science, right? You have to, if you're going to analyze data, you have to talk about what sort of theoretical methods you're going to use. If you're an undergrad student, or if you're a high school student like you are now, I would skip over this, because usually the theoretical framework is not going to be important for you at this stage. The theory stuff usually comes a little bit later, like if you get into third and fourth year university, or if you're a graduate student, then the theory stuff becomes a little more important. So for this article, I would say just skip over it and just don't worry about it, okay? The next section you'll see, I'm on page 3 right now. The next section you'll see is relevant literature. And so this is usually something that you have to do sometimes in academic papers, but often in if you do a master's thesis or if you do a PhD dissertation, you have to do a literature review. So you have to prove that if you're going to talk about oppression in the classroom, you have to show that you've read everything that's ever been written on oppression in the classroom so that you know what you're talking about. Okay? And so if you're doing a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation, you'll probably have a whole chapter that is like a literature review. It's boring. It's boring to write, it's boring to read, and it doesn't really tell you that much, okay? So again, if you're just reading the article, I would skip over it. If you're looking for more, like if you were doing a research paper and you really liked this paper, like this paper worked well for you, then yeah, look at the relevant literature and see if they mention anything else that might be useful to you. But if you're just reading the paper because the prof says you have to, which is exactly the situation we're in now, I would skip over it. I would just not read it, okay? But here, Shavella Pittman is going to talk about, stuff that's been written on gender and race in academic institutions. She's going to talk about gender and race in academic departments. She's going to talk about gender and race in terms of relationships with other colleagues. And so she's just going to review what everyone else has written, right? So that might be important depending on what you're doing, but for the most part, boring, skip over it, okay? But Shavella has to write it to make sure that she's convinced people that she's read everything that she should have read. Research question, I would definitely read that because that's what the paper is about, right? So she's asking herself a question and this paper is going to be the answer to it, right? So I would definitely read that question, and she says it here. She says, what types of experiences do women faculty of color have in their classroom interactions with students? And do women faculty of color experience racial or gender oppression in their classroom interactions with students? And what does that look like? Okay, so that's the whole reason for her paper existing. She's trying to answer this question. And so again, it's worth reading the research question because the paper is the answer to it, right? Here you have method. I would usually skip over the method. Again, usually if you were in a theory class or if you really knew something about sociology, then you might be interested in the method and you might be interested in, knowing what statistical techniques she might have used or how she collected her data. If you're an undergrad student, That's probably not that important, especially if you're an undergrad student with a limited amount of time. I might skip over that one, okay? She interviews people is the, is the short version of that section. She interviews women faculty of color, okay? And then you get to the results. Definitely read the results, right? Because that's the data that she's discovering. And so I would read the results section, because that's all important. And then she comes to a bit of a conclusion, right? And so all scientific academic articles are written this way, right? So they're basically saying, this is the question we have. This is how we're approaching the problem. This is the theoretical framework we're using. And so sociology, anthropology, physics, astrophysics, genetics, all of them will do the same thing. They'll collect a bunch of data and they'll tell you what the data is. And so those are the results that we see here. So again, for her, it's the results of interviews. It might be measurements. It might be genetic code. Could be anything, right? And then she'll get to either a conclusion or a discussion. And so usually that's like, okay, what does it mean, right? What did the results of our study here, what does it mean? What can we take from this? What does it mean for women faculty of color? What does it mean for sociology or social justice, right? So all papers will have something where they try to tell you what it means, right? So this is the question we asked. This is the results that we got. So what, right? And so the author here, Shavella Pittman, is going to tell you, so what? She's going to tell you why these results are important, right? And then she'll get to her reference section, her works cited, if you will. And so you can see that Shavella Pittman, of course, has done an excellent job of citing every source that she's used. If you think that it's probably hellish to format all of those references, you're probably right. I'm sure she didn't enjoy doing all of them, but there they are, right? So she's got pages of 3 pages, 4 pages?
4 pages.
Almost, yeah, three and a bit, right? Over 3 pages of references for this paper, right? And again, that's probably mostly because I bet this was her master's thesis that was turned into an article. And so but yeah, this is exactly how basically all academic articles are organized, right? And so whether you go into sociology or psychology or anthropology, physics, chemistry, bio, whatever, right? Any academic paper you read is usually structured in the same way, right? There's a question that's trying to be answered. There's some background information or theoretical approach. There's some method about how they did their experiment or collected their data. There's the results of that process. And then there's some sort of conclusion or discussion where they say, here's what it all means, people. This is what the significance of this project is. Yeah, they all work the same. And so if I were you, I'd read the abstract, I'd read the question, I'd read the results and the conclusion. The stuff in the middle, I would skip unless the prof specifically says, make sure you pay attention to that, or if you're in sort of a theory course and theory and method are important, right? But again, for most undergrad students, they don't really know enough to analyze the methodology, like the theoretical methods. And so if you're short for time, I would just skip over it and it'll be okay. Because really what the prof wants you to know is, what's the argument here, right? What question is this paper answering? And what does it mean, right? What's the significance of that answer, okay? So again, all academic papers can be broken down like this. It usually doesn't matter if they're, 8 pages or 14 or 30 or 40. They're all like that. They just have more stuff in them, some of them. And again, because this is a very simple question, again, I think it's just her master's thesis. And so, this can be done in 14 pages, right? But Some are bigger, but again, it doesn't mean that there's more in it. They're structured very similarly. Okay? Does that make sense?
Where
Is
can we find this paper?
that paper?
Yeah, like those like research papers. Like, where can we find them?
Where can you find more of them?
Yeah.
If you go to the library and you go into databases A to Z, a number of those databases will take you to academic journal searches. And so JSTOR is one of them, JSTOR. JSTOR is kind of a popular one. I think there's an Academic Search Complete or something like that, which is useful.
Or like Google Scholar.
Google Scholar is another way to, yeah, I'm less familiar with Google Scholar because I'm old, and Google Scholar is slightly newer. But Google Scholar is another one that will take you to academic articles like this. But again, they're all built the same, and so they look intimidating, right? But if you kind of know, if you understand the fact that they're all built the same, and that you just have to figure out what the question is, what the answer to that question is, and what the significance of that question, or what the significance of that answer is. If you can do that, then you're good. And again, there's going to be a lot of detail in here that, as a first-year university student, it's just not going to be that important for you because you're new to the discipline. Maybe this is the only class that maybe this is the first class in sociology that you've ever taken. Maybe it's the last one you'll ever take, right? So again, you just have to know how the article works so that you can pull what you need, understand what you need to understand, and you don't want to get lost in the detail of this because there's a lot of stuff, right? Because Shavella Pittman is not, who's her audience for this article? Who's she?
Student?
Maybe, but who's she really writing for?
The head of the university, I think.
Yes, but also other academics as well, right? That's really who she's addressing. She's addressing the scientific community. She's saying, hey, other sociologists, this is what I did. So actually, she's not really writing for us. She's really writing for her peers, right? Her academic peers. So she's going to, make sure that she's talking at a high level, right? So she's not kind of simplifying it for our sake. And so again, there's going to be a lot of stuff in here that as first-year students, we should probably just not pay too much attention to, right? There's a lot that's just too much detail for us. And so really what we want to do is pull out the argument. What is the question that this article is answering? What's the answer? What are the results? And what does it mean? Right? What does it mean for sociology or for social justice or for science and the existence of humanity as a whole? Right? That's what we're trying to figure out here. Okay? So, that said, I'm going to give you some time to read it. But again, I don't want you to read the whole thing, right? Because the whole thing's too much. So I would read the abstract and the research question and the results and the conclusion. And so that'll cut this down to probably about 5 or 6 pages, I think.
Wait, for the result, like, is it like this one? Just this one?
No, I think the results goes on
Yeah.
because she discovers there's results in a few different categories of experience, or these women have experiences that fall into, I think, 4 general categories. But again, it's a reasonably easy article to read because it's a relatable situation. It's in the classroom. So let's try and read, okay? So maybe what I'll do is I'll give you 10 minutes to start, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back, okay? So I'll put 10 minutes on the clock, and I'll let you start reading, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll see how it's going, okay? And of course, for online people, the article should be in Microsoft Teams, and it's called, I think, exactly this: Race and Gender, Oppression in the Classroom. Okay, people, you want to take a little break? Little break? Okay, let's do it. Back in Okay, people, and we're back.
15 more minutes.
15?
Teen,
50?
teen.
15? I don't know, what do you think? 10 more minutes okay
For what?
to finish reading?
We should finish it first and then discuss.
And then we'll discuss.
15 is good, 15.
Do you need 15?
Yeah,
No, 10.
What, really?
I'll split the difference. I'll give you 12, okay?
No, 30.
12 minutes. 12 minutes, and then we'll finish reading. We'll talk about, and we'll answer these questions, okay? Okay, good people. Can we try and talk about this? Yep. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult was this article to read, would you say?
1 is easy,
1 is easy, 10 is difficult.
5.
Or do I usually do it the other way around? Do I do it the other way around? So one is easy and no, 1 is difficult and 10 is easy? How do I normally do it? Oh, okay. How difficult was it on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being easy, 10 being difficult? Okay. Was it okay?
Yeah, it's good.
It was easy to read, easy enough?
Probably like the easiest like research paper I've ever read.
It probably is. And again, that's another reason I like it, is that it's, for an academic paper, it's pretty readable. Pretty readable. Okay, let's talk about what's going on in there. So, of course, as you saw, you didn't have to read the entire article. You can get enough just by pulling from certain sections. Again, if you have questions about the article, there's always other places you can dig into it. But again, if the prof just wants you to read it to know what was said, then that's kind of all you need to do. You don't need to read every single sentence of it, right? And again, that's probably a good plan, because often when you're in university, you have a lot of reading to do. Sometimes you're working at the same time, and you've got to prioritize, right? And so if something doesn't need to be read and you don't have time to read it, don't read it. But it's best that you can prioritize and figure out what's more useful to read and what's not. And so things like the theoretical framework and the relevant literature, not relevant for you probably. But let's talk about the important part here. So what's Chevella Pittman's argument here?
Women faculty of color report challenges almost exclusively from their white male students.
Right. So women faculty of color are experiencing gendered racism, right? Primarily from white male students. Good. That's her conclusion. That is her, and that's an answer to, if you go back, that's the answer to her original question, right? If you go back to her research question, which is on the 4th page of this document here, she says, whoops, that's method. There it is. She says, what types of experiences do women faculty of color have in their classroom interactions with students? Well, it's one that's characterized by gendered racism, right? That's what we're seeing. And so, she's answering the question with her conclusion. Perfect. Great work, Chevella and Kang. She's got some supporting evidence, though, right? So if women faculty of color are experiencing gendered racism in the classroom, why should we believe that as good critical thinkers, right? What's the evidence for that? And there's a few things.
Challenging authority.
Right. So women professors, women faculty of color have their authority as professors, as the sort of boss in the classroom. They have their authority challenged in a few different ways, right? What's another one?
Threats and intimidation.
Right. There's threats and intimidation, and she kind of doesn't make that clear if she wants that to be a premise or if that's just part of something else. But I think we could include it as a separate premise, is that sometimes that sort of gendered racism goes so far as to be threatening, right? So I think we could include that. What's another one?
Disrespecting scholarly expertise.
Yeah, that these women faculty of color have their scholarly expertise, their status as experts in their field. They have that, that's sort of disrespected or not acknowledged, right? Is there one more?
Yeah, questioning teaching competency.
Right, and then and these women faculty of color have their competency as teachers questioned as well. And again, none of these would be particularly noticeable or noteworthy, except for the fact that who is doing all of this questioning and threatening?
White male students.
Right, it's all coming from white male students. And it's interesting because, and we didn't read this part, but this might be a part that you might have a question about while you're reading, and you might want to go to the framework or the method. But Shavella Pittman didn't ask these professors about what's your experience with white male students. She said, what's your experience in the classroom? So she didn't kind of push, these professors to respond in this way. They just all seem to have reported the same pattern. So she didn't say, oh, tell me about, white male students and how jerky they can be. That would bias the data collection, right? So instead she just said, tell me about your experience in the classroom. And again, these patterns start showing up. And the pattern is that, of course, these women are women, and they're people of color, and the people who seem to be challenging them or causing them trouble in class and outside of class seem to be white male students, right? Yeah, so I think that's perfect. That's what Shavella Pittman's argument is. So my second question here is, what types of oppression are at play in this article? So what kind of social groups are kind of bumping into each other here?
Racism and sexism.
Right, and so the racism, we have people of color, right? And so I think Shavella Pittman has interviewed some black professors, some Asian professors, and some Latina professors, and then we have sexism, right? So we have males and females, or men and women, and Shavella Pittman mentions a bunch of times that there's an intersectionality thing here, right? So these professors are women, but they're also people of color. And so you'll see that come up a number of points in this article, that Shavella Pittman and the women she talks to they're not sure why they're having this experience, right? They're not sure if it's because they are black or Asian or Latina, and they're not really sure if it's because they're women or if it's because they're both at the same time, right? And so that's what intersectionality says, is that at the same time, we're a member of a bunch of different social groups, and sometimes it's not clear which social groups are kind of in play or are influencing the interaction, right? So if you see someone, make a racist comment like, hey, blah, 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 there's no intersectionality there. It has to do with race, right? But here, it's not entirely clear what's going on. Is it because these professors are women? Is it because they're people of color? Or is it because they're both? And it's hard to sort of pull these things apart. I think for number 3, what I was trying to get at was, what kind of things, like in each of Shavella's premises, what kind of behaviors are we seeing? So how do these white male students, how do they challenge the authority of these professors?
They doesn't respect the teacher, like they don't knock the door, they just come in.
Yeah, they don't knock on the door, they just walk in, right? That's not very polite. Yeah, lots of kind of passive aggressive body language, right? Like when you're sitting there in the front row, looking at your prof like this. Like what does that say, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And then when they say something, you're like, right? That's not, yeah, I know. That's not cool, right? That kind of transmits a kind of a disrespectful message to the person who's speaking, right? So yeah, they do that, right? They sit in the front row and they don't pay attention, or they, kind of cross their arms and make faces and things like that. They don't knock. What else do they not do?
They don't call them with Mrs. or Prof or Doctor.
Yeah, they don't use the official titles for these people, even at the same time as they do for others, right? So I think one of these professors mentions that in an email, the student typed the email to the professor and said, "Oh, hi, Kate. Dr. So-and-so said I should talk to you." And Kate was like, "Well, why is he Dr. So-and-so and why am I just Kate? Why am I not Dr. what my last name is," right? And so, again, sometimes it's not entirely clear, right? Because what you call someone depends on the teacher, right? And it also depends on the institution, right? So Here, I think in the secondary program at Columbia, I think most people go by their first names.
Yeah, I think I should call you like Dr. Metcalf.
Well, you shouldn't call me that because I'm not a doctor.
Okay.
I'm not a doctor. You could say Mr. though, but you don't have to. That's too formal for me. But in a university setting, a lot of profs actually want to be referred to as Dr. So-and-so, right? Because they spent 10 years in university to get that doctor in front of their name. So sometimes they want people to use it, right? Others don't. It depends. But yeah, so some students seem to refuse to use, sort of more formal words of addressing these professors, seemingly because they're women or women of color, while at the same time male professors get called doctor and she gets called Kate. Kind of weird. What else do we see? Is there any other authority violations?
During their 2 courses of teaching to their years of education.
Right, and I think that one's a scholarly expertise one, but we can talk about that as well. Yeah, so the instructor here made a mistake. Both of those Roosevelts are U.S. presidents, right? Theodore Roosevelt is in the late 1800s, I think. Franklin Roosevelt is in the 1940s, so they're separated by a little bit of time. But they're both Roosevelts. I don't think they're related. They're both Roosevelts. They might be. Both Roosevelts. She just switched them and said, whoops, wrong one. Sorry, guys, I meant Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then she got a long email from a student saying, well, I taught some grade 6s once, so I know that when you teach, you're supposed to do this. And yeah, like, unsolicited critiques are usually not, received very favorably, and especially when, you're not kind of at the same level as the other person, right? Like if I wrote an email to Justin Trudeau and said, "Dear Justin, here's what you're doing wrong in governing the country. Let me tell you." Yeah, he's going to say, he's never going to read it. But, what do I know about governing a country? Nothing, right? So again, my advice and critiques will not be well received, right? Because I don't know anything about running a country, and I don't even know who Justin is, right? Well, he doesn't know who I am. I know who he is. What else is happening here? How are these students kind of causing some problems for?
Throwing papers at the teachers.
Yeah, so apparently a problem with a grade, right? And so, again, that's pretty disrespectful and rude in any context, right? But if you imagine this professor, this woman, sitting behind her desk in her office, writing a paper or whatever she's doing, and then in walks this male student, who's usually white, doesn't knock, and like throws his paper on her desk. Like, not only is that rude, but is that threatening?
Yeah.
A little bit, right? It's way too much, right? It's not polite, it's rude, it's aggressive, it's threatening, and depending on how that guy kind of expresses himself, it might actually be frightening, right? And so, again, you're kind of seeing all of this stuff, right? You're seeing a lot of disrespect, questioning of authority, threatening or intimidating behavior. All of these things are kind of showing up, right? What else do we see? There were some other ones, but they were a little more complicated, yeah?
Yeah, I think when they say that you are in the minoritized group and we can squash you.
Oh yeah, that was crazy, right? Probably a student who has some white supremacist views, right, freely expresses in class that, oh, by the way, black Americans are in the minority, and so if you want something, you'll have to fight for it. But if you do, we'll squish you, because we're the majority. Yeah. So that's not even a microaggression, right? That's a pretty clearly, I don't know if it's racist, but it's clearly like white supremacist, right? So yeah, if a certain group wants to be treated equally, you'll have to fight for it, but we won't give it to you anyway. So yeah, I think it's pretty racist, right? And to say that in a university class that is being held by, imagine, a black professor, that's a pretty bold statement, right? It's a pretty bold statement to make. What else do we see or hear? There was something about the guy who they watched Blade Runner in the class, and then yeah, they had seen another film or another couple films, and he was kind of like not interested in the other films, and then suddenly he was interested in Blade Runner, right? So what did they say about that?
Like in the Blade Runner, like the main character, I think it's like the white and the minoritized, the bad people are like other group, gender group.
Yeah, so the prof had been showing a film or films in the class that were from the viewpoint of a minoritized group, right? And so Blade Runner is finally, for this guy anyway, finally one that is from the perspective of the dominant group, right? From white males. And so he's like, oh, finally a story that, this is worth it, right? So he kind of devalues or delegitimizes the perspectives of the minoritized groups, right? Oh, these aren't real movies. This isn't a real class. All this social justice stuff is all foofy, whatever, anyway, which you will hear people say. But then suddenly when it gets to something that is in alignment with his values and sort of the stories he's been told, he's like, oh yeah, now this is real scholarship, right? This is real information. That other stuff was whatever, right? And so you'll often hear that, and you'll hear that about, you might hear that about stories from, whether it's film or TV or books. Sometimes things that are created by minoritized groups are seen as less legitimate, right? Less good, for lack of a better term. You'll often see that. You'll also see that sometimes that divide between natural sciences and social sciences. So some people think social sciences are soft sciences and that they're all foofy and talk, and the real stuff is like engineering and physics, right? That's real science. This sociology stuff, it's all whatever. But that's not the case either. But sometimes you see people devaluing certain types of academic pursuits because they think some are more legitimate than others, right? And sometimes that has to do with like hard science and soft science. I'm not sure that those are legitimate terms, but sometimes people say that. And then sometimes you'll see it between courses that are kind of more reflective of the dominant group. They're kind of seen as, real courses. And then the courses that are from the perspective of minoritized group are kind of like, those are just silly, foofy courses, right? What else? Anything else? So there was the teaching competency, the scholarly expertise, the authority, the threats, and intimidation. Yeah, all of those things. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there for today. Come back tomorrow. I'll give you the assignment for the final paper. I'll give that to you tomorrow. I think I've almost got it ready to go. I'll give that to you tomorrow so you can start working. It'll be due on I think it'll be due on the Sunday. Instead of the last day of class, I'll give you the weekend. And so it'll be due on Sunday the 6th, I think it is, December 6th. So a couple more days. But anyway, I'll end it here today. And I'll see you, online people, I'll see you all tomorrow, okay? All right, bye.